Hi, everyone. My group, Kaden, Anna, Brad, Lauren, and I, will be presenting on the Introduction to Nutrition Student Outcomes using open educational resources, also known as OER, versus publisher resources or textbooks. Our faculty mentor is Dr. DeCare, who currently teaches Nutrition 2040, which is Introduction to Nutrition. An overview of what we will be discussing today is the introduction, methodology, overview of statistical analysis, results, discussion, and conclusion. Our research study involved comparing course outcomes between 2018 to 2019, 2019 to 2020, and 2020 to 2021. We analyzed student and faculty attributes. The student attributes were age, race, ethnicity, gender, major, first-generation student status, and then the faculty was race, ethnicity, age, gender, whether they were part-time or full-time. Overall course grades, retention rate, DFW, so if they received a DF or if they withdrew from the course rate, were analyzed to see which was the defining factor for grade outcome. Dr. DeCare is who we worked with, and she helped with gathering our data. Our claim is that students perform better with OER courses than with a traditional publisher textbook.
To begin, a need to pull student, instructor, and course attributes was identified by Dr. DeCare, who was our principal investigator, and an application to the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, of MSU Denver was submitted. Unfortunately, we did face some complications with IRB approval as we had issues with defining consent in the identified data, which caused us to fall a bit behind. But after specifying that the student and instructor data would be de-identified prior to analysis, our group received the necessary data from the Director of BI reporting at MSU Denver. Since demographic collection was not fully tracked until 2017, the consideration for demographic data began in the 2017-2018 academic year. The purpose of our study was to compare the effect of OER to commercially published textbooks on course outcomes. The 2020-2021 academic year was the full transition to OER for the Intro to Nutrition course, with the years 2018-2019 and 2019-2020 being the control groups for our commercially published textbooks. In order to consider the impact of COVID-19 on the transition, independent sample t-tests and chi-square tests were run to compare the 3 academic year ranges on student outcomes. Collectively, our group performed many chi-square tests and t-tests to analyze the data that we received. We used SPSS as our main statistical analysis tool for running these tests. We examined the effects of generational status, instructor method, major, age, gender, race, and ethnicity on overall course outcome during the specified school years. To begin,
So our plan of analysis initially started with t-tests to compare the significance of outcomes pre-OER introduction and post-OER introduction within the student population. As we continued discussing with our principal investigator, Dr. DeCare, the inclusion of COVID implications impacting these course outcomes was brought up into the table. And this altered our t-test approach to include a 3rd year, bridging the pre and post test or pre and post OER introduction years. After running these 3 tests to compare the 3 years, there were no immediate statistical significance identified. So this prompted our group to expand our analyses to include student and instructor attributes and how the impact on the 3 years worth of data was impacted to see if there's any specific demographic attribute that we should be focusing on over the course of those 3 years, pre-OER, during OER, during COVID, and post-OER introduction during COVID. After establishing the need for more in-depth analyses, our group decided to run a chi-square test to evaluate the impact of attribute frequencies with the course outcome frequencies, as I mentioned earlier. This step would determine whether the results that we have and are showing reflect our hypothesis of OERs having a positive impact on course outcomes, or whether the results reflected our null hypothesis, where the OER has absolutely no impact on course outcomes overall. As our results were computed and analyzed, as you'll be hearing more from Kate here shortly, we discovered a range of statistical significance and non-significance per attribute per year, which is a little confounding and a little confusing. But this will propel our future analyses forward to look at specifics within each statistically significant year, as Anna will be discussing later on with you.
When looking at the results, there were 5 variables that we used to compare how traditional textbooks and OER textbooks affected final outcome of grade. And the first one we looked at was gender, which we split each variable up by a person in our group. And so Lauren looked at gender first, and to determine the effects of student gender on our course outcome, we decided to run a chi-square test for each school year, 2018 to 2019, 2019 to 2020, and 2020 to 21, comparing gender to final grade. So looking at the result on the right of the chi-square test, you will see that there was not much difference between the gender in any of the school years for letter grades, meaning that there was little significance between genders. So this helps us, as we can now eliminate student gender as being a major driving force for grade outcome, and we will be able to further narrow down contributing factors. The next variable we looked at was instructor method and overall course grade. So when looking at the chi-square test between the instructor method and overall course grade, there was a significant difference in the 2018 and 2019 school year. And so this indicates that there may be some significance when using a publisher resource versus an OER textbook. The next variable we looked at was generational status and course outcome. And when looking at the chi-square test during the 2020 and 2021 academic year, when OER textbooks were used, there is not a great difference compared to the test results from the 2018-2019 year or 2019 to 2020 school year. So there was no statistical difference between generational statuses, and so therefore they can be eliminated as a cause for course outcome. The next variable we looked at was age and overall course grade, and the chi-square test seen here showed that there was a significant difference. So during practicum 3, we're also going to run a post hoc test to gather more information on this difference to see the significance. The last variables that we looked at were race and ethnicity, which on the left you can see race and on the right you can see ethnicity. And what we figured out is that the ethnicity tests demonstrated statistical significance on the pre-COVID publisher year and during COVID OER year. And there was little significance in the interim COVID year during 2019 to 2020 with the publisher text. And then the race test showed low statistical significance across all 3 years. And our PI expressed the importance of this as some previous studies reviewed literature with results showing non-white demographics having lower academic outcomes compared to white demographics.
So as Kaiten said, we found no statistical differences in course grades between genders. So that can be eliminated as a factor having an effect on course outcome. When looking at generational status, there was no significant difference found between generational status and grades. We were interested in looking at that attribute because we thought that maybe being a first generation student meant having less access to resources, and that could possibly affect grades. But now that we've run the statistical analysis, we can see that this factor can be eliminated when we're looking at OERs versus publisher resources. When looking at instructor methods, there was a significant difference in instructor method and course grades during just the 2018 and 2019 school year. During that school year, a publisher resource was used, so that could indicate that teaching method had an effect on course grades more than the type of textbook used. Plus, during 2018 to 2019, there was more face-to-face methods used because that was prior to COVID and the shift to hybrid and online learning. Also, as Caden mentioned, we also found some significant differences when looking at race and ethnicity. Regarding age, there was a little significance found. So during practicum 3, we plan to run a post hoc analysis on the attributes that showed significant differences. So that would be instructor method, age, race, and ethnicity. And that post hoc analysis will help us identify more clearly where the differences lie, which Caroline's going to talk about more on the next slide. Also during practicum 3, we plan to run a chi-square test on student major and course grade. We're thinking that major could have an effect on grades because if the student's major isn't related to nutrition and they're taking the introduction to nutrition course, they might not try as hard in the course and get a worse grade. So we'll need to know that if we need to consider major when looking at OERs versus publisher resources.
The next steps for our project will be to continue to analyze data with Dr. DeCare and interpret those results. We will be running a post hoc test to determine where there's a significant difference. We originally believed that OER courses would help benefit the students and that they would perform better in those courses. But with our data, it is leaning more towards a traditional publisher textbook is better. So that is why we will be running a post hoc test. Of course, this could be due to COVID and having to go to fully online courses, as that is the first year that the OER textbook was implemented. So we are also analyzing data from other school years. The next steps for our